Oh, it was a while ago, and I was going to maybe ask for some advice in a situation where there may be no advice, but because I was interested in you saying about messy improvisation. I was just thinking that the last day of the festival there's going to be kind of what we might call a jam session, and there might be one person or 15 or 20 people turning up, and I think there's basically no structure to it. I'm just wondering, would you have any kind of formal advice of will it work? Can it work, you think? Because you were saying basically anything more than 4 or 5 people, stay away. Maybe that is the advice, stay away.
I don't know how useful the advice would be without being there and seeing who they were, because I think it varies enormously depending on who's there, all kinds of things. And sometimes it's to do with gender as well, you know. So I do workshops all over the place, and I always ask for an equal gender balance, because I find it actually helps to create the space that I'm looking for. And very often I'll find that that means 1 woman and 15 guys. And the guys are always trying to prove something, and in the end, the woman is usually trying to prove something as well as a result of that. So it produces a kind of an awkward dynamic. But what I've discovered from the point of view of that kind of situation is that it actually helps if you can do something first which doesn't involve the instruments. So that if you spend an hour doing games or things that you can invent yourself, in which nobody is allowed to play their instrument, in other words they're using only their bodies and their voices, it has a way of de-hierarchicalizing the situation and also allowing people to perceive who each other is without reference to their virtuosity. So people get very inhibited by thinking that whether they're going to be good enough or whether the other people are going to be better than they are, or all these weird things that go on in the back of your mind all the time, which are totally irrelevant. So if you get rid of that right off the bat, you can achieve a certain kind of dynamic which then starts from a kind of a listening viewpoint. And then you can bring the instruments in later and see what happens.
You were talking the other day about this idea of virtuosic, as an improviser is a virtuosic listener. Do you practice it?
When I improvise, sure. Did you mean something other than that?
Not particularly, no. No, do you consciously I don't know, listen to a piece of recorded music repeatedly, looking for different things? Do you consciously train your listening?
Not really. I think I've been very resistant to any form of removing myself from my environment, so I've never liked wearing headphones, Walkman, iPod, any of this stuff. I get upset when I have to cover my ears with something. Even being in a recording studio is problematic from that point of view. And I think that's because I like very much to be in the sound environment that I'm in and perceive it in its totality. I spent a lot of time when I was a kid. I'm a bird watcher since 40 years, and the way I got into bird watching was because I used to go fishing in Yorkshire. And of course never used to catch anything, but I was sitting for long periods of time doing nothing and therefore listening to the environment, and I became much more aware of everything else that was going on around me than actually what was going up and down in the water. So that's how I started to see things, and then I started to be in touch in a certain way, and I like that feeling of being in touch. So if there's any training involved, it's the training of being very quiet and observing with your ears and eyes what's going on around you.
Yeah, how does this relate? I don't know, I'm sure you're aware of soundscape movement with people like Murray Schafer. Do your thoughts on does the soundscape match their thoughts?
I don't know what their thoughts are. Tell me about it.
A group of Canadians in the 70s trying to formalize the notions of soundscape and actually coming to a stage where you analyze the soundscape of the city. And
you're talking about people like Hildegard Westerkamp and so on.
Right. Ron and Barry Truax and people like that. Do you see that as a separate thing from what you just talked about, or because you're talking about it in an experiential way?
I kind of, in a way, I kind of feel as if a lot of it is the commodification of the environment, which I kind of don't like very much. But on the other hand, I like Westerkamp's work because she has a certain kind of social element which involves putting people in touch with their environment in a way that they hadn't noticed before. And I, you know, her walks I think, been very productive in that sense. But I don't know.
But I mean, it does tie in. You were talking before about your own graphic scores and Braxton's systems, and John and Zoran's game pieces as a set of constraints within which hopefully certain things can happen. And one can perhaps relate that to this idea of soundscape. There's a certain constraint which is your environment, and that's your reality around you. And within those constraints, certain things can happen.
But I think, isn't all music necessarily based on the idea of a constraint?
Absolutely. Except for, I guess, one of the side B questions to this is, one thing I was going to ask you about is the impact of technology in music and the drive behind many researchers and developers of technology with the aim of things being made possible that weren't possible before, i.e. that's the idea that things are constraints and instruments are constraints, and wouldn't it be great if there were no constraints, and wouldn't it be great if we could use the technology to go beyond those constraints? I'm
very much against this idea.
Yeah.
And actually it's interesting for me because I've been using technology now since I first walked into a recording studio in about 1972. And what has been interesting for me to observe is that up until the mid to late 80s, if not a little later, the development of music technology was primarily the domain of engineers, and it was primarily aimed at recording studio situations which had to do with engineers. And so, you know, there's a thing like a noise gate, which was obviously designed to reduce events on a tape so that you don't have to deal with, you know, doing faders and stuff, which with computer mixing became kind of irrelevant because you can do it all computer-wise. But originally, you know, it was a way to get rid of unwanted sound on a tape, so the gate only opens when the signal you want to hear is going through the gate. And it was musicians who figured out that this is actually something which has other applications, and it usually was that way. Almost every piece of equipment that was designed by engineers for an engineering perspective was then abused by musicians for a musical perspective. And that's how many, many, many things were developed in studios. I can remember that particular noise gate application, for example, when the Art Bears, a band I was in the early 80s, late 70s, when we were recording and discovered that you could actually not only cut out noise, but use it in the reverse way by triggering something only when something occurred. And we were using this to, for example, we had a vacuum cleaner, and every time Chris hit the snare drum, it would open the gate to hear the vacuum cleaner, and so the vacuum cleaner becomes a part of the sound of the drums. You never hear it as a vacuum cleaner, but you hear a sound that you would not have heard otherwise. These are examples of the way musicians can be inventive with things that were not designed for them to be inventive with. Just like, you know, you saturate an eventide harmonizer to the point that it's completely malfunctioning, it starts to get interesting. There was a certain point when suddenly the manufacturers got the idea that actually the people they should be talking to was the musicians, so they started dialoguing with the musicians and saying, what do you need? What kind of thing do you want? And the result was a series of instruments which were much less easy to abuse and much more predictable. And interestingly enough, I talked to an engineer from Yamaha not long after the DX7 had been introduced, which was kind of the first kind of really programmable synthesizer of the digital era. And the thing that they had found and been very disconcerted by was that when the instruments first started coming back for routine repairs, they discovered that 90% of them had not even been programmed. They were people who were only buying them for the sounds that were already in them, and they were not in any way tempted by it actually doing what they thought they were inventing the thing to do. So it's paradoxical, there are all kinds of things, but my sense is that instruments have become less interesting the more they've been designed by musicians with musical things in mind, and I find that interestingly perverse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.